Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start the recording. Welcome, everybody. We are so glad to have you with us this evening. My name is Charisse. You will find me at the Central Branch. I am here with my colleague Nancy, who you will find at the Miller Branch. We are excited to present part 2 of Dr. Carter G. Woodson, The Origins and Significance of Black History. The class is being recorded and we will be sharing it on the library YouTube channel shortly in the future, and we will keep you posted on that. You can turn on and off the closed captions using the More button. Please use the chat for technical issues and the Q&A for questions. We will take questions at the end. You'll be muted and the video will be off, but we will take your questions. So use the chat for any technical questions and Q&A for any questions for our speaker. Please note that the Zoom captions are automatically generated, so there may be errors. I will also be putting in the chat any references that our speaker refers to, as well as links to our survey and other amazing programs at the library. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Many of you have enjoyed classes with him before, but for those of you who are new, I will go ahead and tell you about all his wonderful accomplishments. Our speaker's name is Marcus Sankofa. He holds a Master of Arts degree in African American Studies from Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. His research primarily focuses on African American educational history, post-Civil War, through the Jim Crow era in the US. An instrumental aspect of his work as a historian and researcher is through the in-depth exploration of African American educational history of Maryland and local Howard County. He's worked in Maryland's Howard County public school system for over 12 years as an achievement liaison for the Black Student Achievement Program, working to eliminate educational disparities amongst Black African American students. He has served as a consultant for numerous educators on supporting Black African American students through a culturally relevant, trauma-informed approach. Marcus Nix is the co-teacher of the African American Studies seminar course and serves as a member of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Coalition for Wildlife High School. His work in the community extends from Howard County, Maryland to Baltimore City with the TNAT Holistic Wellness Center, where he supports Black families toward achieving optimum wellness through what Marcus refers to as a culturally based African-centered model. He also enjoys collaborating with local institutions of public history, where he serves as an educational consultant and one who provides professional development support for K through 12 educators across the state of Maryland. Marcus's mission is to empower, educate, and inspire others through the awareness of African American culture and history. He is a proud husband, father, and son who is passionate about his role to uplift his community. We are so lucky to have him in our community and especially lucky to have him with us this evening. And I will turn it over to you, Marcus. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Charisse, and thank you, Nancy. I'm delighted and excited to be here yet again for part 2 of our virtual web series for the Howard County Public Library System. And so we had a great time. I had a absolutely wonderful time last Tuesday. So we're back here yet again for part 2 with the webinar series theme entitled at hand, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, The Origins and Significance of Black History. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, The Origins and Significance of Black History. All right. So it's already pretty much been stated by Charisse in terms of some things to keep in mind and some things to consider moving forward, but just wanted to put out there again, just to be open for our presentation and our discussion, be willing to learn, which I'm sure everybody is here to do. Also, make sure that you listen actively, reduce distractions if possible, be present, bring your whole self here. At the end, we'll have time for a conversation, Q&A, for exchange of questions and dialogue. We also ask at this point to respect all viewpoints and embrace discomfort. When we talk about history, especially as we see nowadays, history doesn't necessarily always come with the feel good, but there could be parts of history as we reflect on history that can not always be comfortable, but that discomfort could also help us to get to a point of growth and empowerment and healing. So those are just some things to keep in mind and consider moving forward for today. So I'm sure there are a number of us who have attended the first session and you're here for part two. And there may be some of us who did not attend the first session, but you're here for the second part. So there weren't a whole lot of objectives. I decided to keep it simple for our web series. However, there were some things that I did want to make sure that I mentioned and really touched on to get to the root of Black history, its roots, its origins and significance, and how we find ourselves engaging with Black history today. So last week, we spoke about the historical Black educational tradition. We spoke about the story that has not been told from the Black lens, from the Black perspective, from the Black viewpoint, and the importance of telling the story and what its present day implications are. And so today, what we're going to do is really get into the legacy of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And then what we'll also do is address Black history knowledge and how learning about Black history, getting this information about the Black experience historically, how does this shape how we think? How does this impact our mental health and our sense of wellness and our overall well-being? So once again, just tying back to what we discussed last Tuesday, we spent some time talking about the erasure of history as it pertains to the Black experience. And when we talk about this erasure, and we see that there have been a number of attempts to keep Black expression and to keep the history of Blacks, African American individuals, groups from being told. Malcolm X has a quote that says, "Education is the passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today." So when we speak about the role of education and suppressing the Black voice and not allowing Black perspectives and Black history to be told, and there's a huge amount of impact. And so now in 2022, we see there being efforts to still suppress Black voice, Black expression, but it also was leading others to want to further explore and engage with history. So when we talk about the implications of education, and to Malcolm's quote, how education is a passport to the future, well, historically, African Americans have had their educational pursuits blocked. And so that has kept them from being able to, strive for future endeavors and from trying to accomplish different things. However, what we spoke about last Tuesday was also the efforts continuously to educate oneself or to educate a group of people. So when we talk about the implications of education, we're talking about, higher status, upward mobility. For African Americans to be educated and to learn, could enhance your business savvy, and it could, enable you to be able to put yourself in a position where you can negotiate and navigate in certain spaces that you used to could not navigate. When we talk about the implications of education as it pertains to African Americans, we're also talking about societal participation. And one glaring example of that is when you look at what happened post-emancipation and so many African Americans were starting to become more prominent into the political arena. And you find that with so many Black towns developing and being established, African Americans were definitely a vital force in the political arena. However, when it comes to education, Black success, how having education as a Black person automatically puts you in a space where you were a target, intimidation, fear, threat, and trauma, even violence. And even to this day, we see a number of HBCUs still getting bomb threats, curriculum violence. Many scholars and professors have instituted this term curriculum violence of whenever a group of people don't have their history, their culture, and their heritage in the history books, this could create a lot of psychological damage on the mind. And we'll speak about that later on as well. And also we spoke about last Tuesday, for part 1 of our virtual series, literacy laws and how, or anti-literacy laws, and how these anti-literacy laws really impacted the way that these African Americans would have to strive to obtain their education. So this is just a cap of what we talked about last week. And so, as I mentioned, today we're going to focus and hone in more so on the legacy of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And then we're going to get to Black history knowledge and how this can impact our wellness and our mental health. So when we talk about Dr. Carter G. Woodson, he was the second African American to graduate with a PhD from Harvard University. All right, some of us may or may not be familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois, but he was the first. And so W.E.B. Du Bois, an intellectual, a scholar, a professor in his own right, a trailblazer, a pioneer, he was one who finished in 1895. And so Dr. Carter G. Woodson finished after him in 1912. And Dr. Carter G. Woodson was the first to get his PhD from formerly enslaved parents. So even though Dr. Carter G. Woodson was the second to get his PhD from Harvard in 1912, he was the first to obtain his PhD from formerly enslaved parents. And so what the history books tell us is that whenever Carter G. Woodson passed away in 1950, the obituary was written by W.E.B. Du Bois. And in that obituary, there's a quote, and the quote is right here on the slide. And the quote that W.E.B. Du Bois put in the obituary of Dr. Carter G. Woodson was, quote, "What race prejudice can do to the human soul and what is powerless to prevent." What race prejudice can do to the human soul and what it is powerless to prevent. And so as W.E.B. Du Bois put those words within the confines of Dr. Carter G. Woodson's obituary, what he's pretty much speaking to is how Dr. Carter G. Woodson did not allow race prejudice to stop him from devoting his life and committing himself to the upliftment and the empowerment of the Black race. And so it just speaks to the tenacity that Dr. Carter G. Woodson had. And it also speaks to just how much respect his contemporaries had for him. Dr. Carter G. Woodson is considered the father of Black History Month. However, never did Dr. Carter G. Woodson consider himself or refer to himself as a father of Black History Month. In fact, it was the respect of his contemporaries that bestowed that honor on him. So nowadays, how you'll see a lot of people, I'm the self-proclaimed this and self-proclaimed that. Dr. Carter G. Woodson never referred to himself as that, which also speaks to his humility in spite of all of the prolific accomplishments that he achieved. So Dr. Carter G. Woodson did a lot of different things, but Dr. Carter G. Woodson is just one individual, and the works and the life and the deeds and the legacy of Dr. Carter G. Woodson is really an expansion of the Black intellectual tradition that preceded him. So the story with Carter G. Woodson is that he grew up in poverty. He attended school for about 4 or 5 months out of the year, and his father was illiterate, but he wanted to make sure that Carter, his son, would become literate and can know how to read and write. And so he made sure that Carter would read to him. He made sure that they would find old newspapers and old books, and he would ask Carter to read different excerpts from these different pieces of literature. And that right there helped to cultivate in Carter G. Woodson a sense of hunger for knowledge, and he used to enjoy reading to his father. However, as Carter continued to grow, he would end up having working a range of menial jobs. And one of the things that Carter G. Woodson would do in his teenage years, he would actually work in the coal mines. And so working in the coal mines is hard, arduous, backbreaking labor. And Dr. Carter G. Woodson gives personal accounts to him working those coal mines, and there being a gentleman named Oliver Jones who befriended him, took Carter G. Woodson under his wing. Oliver Jones was a former military veteran. He couldn't read or write and wasn't literate himself. However, at the end of the day, whenever Carter and Oliver Jones and the other gentleman would finish working, Oliver Jones had in his home a parlor where the gentleman would come and convene and talk about the day and just gather, talk about current events, or just talk about what was going on in society. And in that parlor was also shelves and books and literature and newspapers and things of that nature. And Oliver Jones would actually encourage Carter G. Woodson to pick up those books and read them. And he would have Carter G. Woodson read the newspaper. And Carter G. Woodson would read the newspaper to Oliver Jones and all these other gentlemen who were illiterate. And whenever Carter G. Woodson would read the newspaper, whenever he would say something and if they were curious, if they had a debate over it or something didn't make sense or something wasn't adding up properly, then they would send Carter out into the field to further investigate, to discover and dig up the answer. And then he would come back and report on his findings. And so Carter G. Woodson is very much appreciative of that experience because that cultivated in him the desire and the work ethic of inquiry and curiosity to go pursue the answers and get to the root of knowledge. And so one of the things that Dr. Carter G. Woodson says in terms of showing his appreciation for this experience is, quote, "I learned so much because of the more extensive reading required by him than I would have undertaken for my own benefit. My interest in penetrating the past of my people was deepened and intensified." So in that quote, Carter G. Woodson is referencing Oliver Jones, who once again is the war veteran who's working in the coal mines alongside with Carter G. Woodson, but he sees this young up and coming young man. He sees something in him and he's pushing him and thrusting him to read and to engage with ideas in the literature. And he's coming on a daily basis and reporting back what he's learning. And the story actually is in this book here called Carter Reads the Newspaper. It's a children's book. And I referenced this book before last Tuesday, but it's a phenomenal book, and I'll reference it again. And so Carter G. Woodson wasn't only just inspired by his parents. He wasn't only just inspired by Oliver Jones and what it was that those experiences that he had after he would get off and from working in the coal mines, but he was also inspired by those who came before him. As he began to learn, as he began to read history, he got inspired by those who paved the way for him to even have an opportunity to do what he did. So one of the individuals was George Washington Williams. And you see here on the slide here on the right-hand side, this is the image of him. And so many of us are familiar with the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah Jones. And so the 1619 Project right now is getting a lot of attention. A lot of people are talking about it. But George Washington Williams was one who actually chronicled the plight of the Black experience in America from 1619 first, originally. And so George Washington Williams didn't have the PhD, or he didn't have the degree honors like Carter G. Woodson. However, he was a self-trained historian. He was an author, and he was also a former soldier in the war as well too. And so it was individuals like him and a host of other individuals who went on to inspire Dr. Carter G. Woodson. So it wasn't just George Washington Williams. There's evidence and there's various accounts of many African Americans being able to become literate, being able to read, being able to write, even though they may have first began as an enslaved person. And so this list here is a snapshot of just some of the individuals that started out enslaved. However, they would eventually be able to obtain their freedom in various ways of resistance, and they was able to use their literacy as a vehicle and a tool to liberate themselves and others amongst them. And the history books show that a number of these individuals, PBS Pinchback, Frederick Douglass, you see here a slave narrative of Frederick Douglass, Bishop M. Turner, Bishop Isaac Lane, Lucy C. Laney, W.F. Scarborough, Bishop John Wesley Gaines, Bishop Lucius Holsey, Harriet Jacobs. These individuals, they used their pen to be able to write ideas and spread those ideas. They were significant in terms of the Black print culture because Black newspapers helped to push and expand their ideas. And you see that literacy was used as a vehicle of resistance. And as we spoke about last Tuesday, when it came to a lot of the uprisings and slave revolts, they found that those who were at the forefront, those who were at the helm, leading the charge, oftentimes it was those individuals that had a link and tie to some form of literacy. So when we talk about Carter G. Woodson, he's being inspired by his parents. He's growing up in poverty. He had a hard way to go and struggled, and remembered oftentimes he would have to retire early and go to bed early so he could take off his clothes so his mother could wash his clothes so he could have something to wear the next day. He would say a lot of times he would get up from the dinner table still hungry, and he would have to go out into the field and pick berries and eat them. So he came from very humble beginnings, and it was those who he read and those who he discovered and learned about, which propelled him to have something inside of him that wanted to further and build upon and capitalize the work of those who went before him. And some of these individuals that you see right here went on to establish freedom schools. They went on to, educate the community or those in their family or those around them. Some of these individuals also wrote textbooks as well too. So even Black textbooks, which is what Black schools would use, and all different types of things came through literacy. So when we hear the narrative a lot of times mentioned about so many of the enslaved not knowing how to read and not knowing how to write, yes, there were a lot of the enslaved who did not know how to read and who did not know how to write and that were illiterate. However, many could read and write, and many did engage and grapple with literacy because, as we mentioned last week, a lot of times, even if you knew certain things, you might have to keep it on the hush. You might not need to say a whole lot because that would automatically make you be a target. So Dr. Carter G. Woodson, once again, is riding the wave with his Black intellectual tradition that preceded him. And so with Carter G. Woodson, he's born in 1875 and he passes in 1950. He's born in Virginia. His vision was to empower the Black race. His vision was to do two fundamental things at the core. So he wanted to legitimize the teaching of Black history in academia, which was a space in which he frequented. And he also wanted to popularize Black history for everyday folks. So when it comes to the teaching of Black history in academia, what he called for was a critical analysis and a critical examination of the historical record, thorough research, densely footnoted material, citations, objectivity, and not making knowledge claims without evidence. So Dr. Carter G. Woodson wasn't into romanticizing things or making stuff up just to feel good. He was all about giving credibility to the space because he knew he was one of the few Blacks that was in that space that was predominantly populated by white men, but he also wanted to give credibility and validity and substantiation to his claims about saying that Blacks have no history or Blacks were inferior. This was what he was trying to push back on. And so one of his quotes that he's known for, if a race has no history, it has no worthwhile tradition. It becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world and it stands in danger of being exterminated. So it was about those counter narratives. It was about liberating the mind from the ideology of, of inferiority. It was about, empowering the mind so that way history could be used as a vehicle to uplift, to impact people's self-esteem, self-concept, self-worth, and self-value. Dr. Carter G. Woodson knew that history and what a group of people have been told about their past had direct implications on how they viewed themselves in the present. He knew that, and he devoted the totality of his life for that. But it wasn't just to legalize the teaching of Black history in academia, but what he also sought to do was popularize Black history for everyday folks. So even though he was a scholar, even though he was an academic, he was a professor, he was a teacher for 30 plus years, all of these things, he still had that grassroots foundation to him. And he credits a lot of that with his upbringing and what he encountered as a young person. And he still maintained what scholars say is the working class ethos. He worked 18 hours a day. He was a tenacious reader. He was a tenacious writer because he believed that this cause was a life and death struggle. One of the many books that he authored, he also published countless articles, wrote columns, different things of that nature. One of the books that he's most known for is a book entitled The Miseducation of the Negro. And in The Miseducation of the Negro, there's a quote that he puts within the book that says, quote, starting out after the Civil War, the opponents of freedom and social justice decided to work out a program which would enslave the Negro's mind in as much as the freedom of the body had to be conceded. So he's speaking to after slavery, after emancipation, after Civil War, the forces still at work to impact the mind and impact the body of African Americans, striving for freedom, striving for upward mobility, striving to now step out on all of these different liberties that they have been denied for so long. And so when we talk about the forces and things that Carter G. Woodson was up against, well, in academia, he was confronting racist scholarship. So when it comes to the scholarship battles and the ideology battles, a person by the name of William A. Dunning, and William A. Dunning back in the early 1900s was considered an authority on history. There was even a school called the Dunning School, and this is one of his works here. And one of the things that Dunning says, quote, "The Negro was not ready for self-government, no voting rights or equal citizenship." So Carter G Woodson knew he had to have his stuff tight. He knew he had to have his stuff together because it was these ideas that he was warring with within the field of academia, specifically within the field of history. Another person who was also considered an authority when it comes to history, how history would be taught, how history would be imagined, was Ulrich Phillips. And he had a quote in his book that said, quote, "Slavery was economically unprofitable. Slave masters didn't make any money off slavery. Slavery was good for the Negro because it was a training school for civilization." So this is, once again, an example of what Carter G. Woodson was combating and challenging and pushing back against within the context of these professional academic spaces that he was in. You also find that during this time, it wasn't just the academic battles, and it wasn't just what was going on in academia, but there was a lot surrounding the nation in general as well. Lynchings were happening 1 out of every 3 days in the South. Minstrel shows were national moneymakers and were really, for the most part, the most popular form of entertainment during this time of the early 1900s. Voter suppression and harassment and intimidation was still alive and well. Negative stereotypes were continuously portrayed in the media. One, for example, Birth of a Nation, which came out in 1915, which portrayed African Americans in negative stereotypes, and Woodrow Wilson in the White House actually displayed that movie, and it would become a nationally known film. Magazines depicting African Americans in certain ways that were negative, the word coon being used loosely, the N-word, the Great Migration. So African Americans protesting with their feet, resisting with their feet, moving, up the Eastern corridor, up the Midwest, and into the far distant South. And we spoke about a book last week, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, which speaks to that specifically. However, because all of this was going on, African Americans were trying to step out on faith and obtain their liberties and their freedom as much as they could. They were trying to really take their life in their own hands as a result of the racism, the hostility, the brutality, the intimidation, the harassment, and everything else. Race uprisings were happening during this time. So Wilmington, North Carolina, 1896, Atlanta, Georgia, 1906, Springfield, Illinois, 1908, East St. Louis, 1917, Chicago, Illinois, 1919. And, there's even a situation with the Chicago race uprising where a young man, a Black boy named Eugene Williams, he goes swimming in a segregated section of the beach, and he gets stoned, and a fight ensues, and a big uproar ensues, and the next thing you know, there's a Chicago race riot that happens. The Tulsa, Oklahoma race riot or uprising that many of us have come to know. Rosewood, Florida, 1923, and Red Summer, 1919, where up to 25 uprisings took place. So I'm saying all this to give some context to the forces that were happening in academia and the forces that were happening surrounding academia in different avenues around the country. And so Carter G. Woodson knew all of these things were happening. As a Black man, he was experiencing these things. He came from a situation where his family was poor. His parents are formerly enslaved. So all of this is leaning on Carter G. Woodson, which is perpetuating and propelling him and giving him the energy and the vigor to continue to fight this battle and to push forward a mass educational movement. So as we continue, Carter G. Woodson wanted to make one thing straight. Carter G. Woodson said, Black history is not just about 1 month, or is it about 1 week? So even though he started out wanting it to be Negro History Week, and Negro History Week was first inaugurated in 1926, he was very clear about where he was trying to go with this vision. And so there's a quote that he states that helps encapsulate that. And he says, quote, "Do not wait until the last moment to prepare for Negro History Week. The time is nigh at hand. Secure the necessary literature at once and begin to plan immediately to demonstrate to the community what you and your co-workers have learned about the Negro during the year." So at this point in time, with Dr. Carter G. Woodson trying to propel and push forward a shift in the thinking of other people and trying to correct the falsehoods and the distorted narratives of history, he knew that he had to start slow, and he knew that it was going to take some time. But it was not for him just only a week-long celebration, and it would eventually become a month, which is where we are now. But his vision and his original idea was for it to be a way to commemorate and recognize the teaching of Black history that happened throughout the whole entire year. So he was an institution builder. He was an institution builder. He knew that he had to work with other people and that he was going to have to connect with other people. He knew that he was going to have to work as a team, so to speak, and get some assistance with such a large task at hand. So in 1915 in Chicago, he was able to begin the process of starting the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. So this was not just any organization, but this was the first organization that was devoted to the study of the life of African Americans and their history. And so at the time, it was called the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. And that came about in 1915. The Journal of Negro History would follow soon thereafter. And the Journal of Negro History was scholarly, and it was articles, different essays, different things in the Journal of Negro History that could be researched, that from a scholarly level could be able to challenge these false narratives and be able to paint the African American in a broader scope and in a broader picture outside of the racist limitations that were so common during the time. Later on, as I mentioned before, Negro History Week would come into play. And Negro History Week would happen in 1926 as a result of Carter G. Woodson and those who he worked with his association. And Negro History Week actually, according to many accounts, was one of the biggest accomplishments of the organization. Carter G. Woodson did a whole lot and worked with a lot of people to push forward what this Negro History Week celebrations were. And so these Negro History Week celebrations would take on the form of banquets, breakfasts, speeches, parades, exhibits, lectures. Carter G. Woodson was working with all types of community entities, HBCUs, Black churches, grassroots community organizations, community centers. He was in the neighborhoods. He was in the live. He was all over the place with the organization. And what you see here is to the left-hand side is actually Carter G. Woodson's home, but it was also a 3-story home that is located in Northwest Washington, D.C., 1538 9th Street. And this would become the headquarters of the association. So he lived on the upper level on the top floor of this 3-story Victorian style home in the Shaw neighborhood district of Washington, D.C. But there would be meetings here. There would be conferences here. There would be conventions here. There would be gatherings here in this space. And so it was this space here that also helped Carter G. Woodson be able to publish his books. This is where he wrote his books. In fact, he actually started his own publishing company as well, too, called Associated Publishers, to be able to not only write to the experience of Black people, but he also owned his own publishing company. So he had the rights to the publishing and all of these different things. So he was very entrepreneurial minded. He was very forward thinking. He was quite an astute businessman at that. But one of the things that ended up happening was with the Journal of Negro History, with that being a scholarly entity, it would be over the heads of some of the children and some of those who weren't necessarily on a scholastic level. So the Negro History Bulletin would come later on down the line in 1937, and Mary McLeod Bethune, who is a legendary historical educator and African-American woman in her own right, worked very closely with Carter G. Woodson and the association. She worked with his materials, she worked with his literature, she visited him frequently, he visited her, and she actually says in her own accounts, or it's been said in the historical accounts, that there was only one person that Carter G. Woodson allowed to refer to him as Carter, and that was Mary McLeod Bethune. Everybody else had to call him Mr. Woodson. So he was not only entrepreneurial minded, he was not only hardworking, he was not only passionate, he was not only knowledgeable, but he was also strict. He was also very, very stern. And there was a humorous story that I came across with Langston Hughes, who came down to intern with Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And Dr. Carter G. Woodson had asked him to catalog some materials and to store some materials. And Langston Hughes, that was a little bit too much work for Langston Hughes. There was, Carter G. Woodson was used to that coal miner work ethic. Carter G. Woodson was an early riser, late finisher. And he was very stern. He was very strict. He was very adamant about the task of pushing forward Black history and changing the narrative of the Black experience. And so Langston Hughes and Carter G. Woodson ended up parting ways. But it spoke to just how hard Dr. Carter G. Woodson went at trying to push this mass educational movement of Black history. So here's this home that Carter G. Woodson purchases, and this is the headquarters and the foundation of the association. 1976, this home actually becomes a historic landmark, as you see here. And the house is still up to this day. I'm not exactly sure if people could pass through yet. I know before the pandemic, it was open as a museum. People could come in and check out the space and look at the inside, but I'm not sure if it's open yet. But in 1976, it actually would become a historic landmark. And so Asala has played an integral part. Asala, the organization, is still up today. But the only difference is, even though it started out as the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, it then changed its name to Asala, which is Association for the Study of African American Life and History. So we see that this was the epicenter of the movement, and some of the things that took place within the four walls of this place here, this institution, was that Carter G. Woodson ended up employing interns. He ended up employing field agents who would help to increase memberships in the association. He helped to organize Negro history clubs in Washington, D.C., and various places, and all throughout the country from an elementary to collegiate level. He wrote correspondences. Carter G. Woodson and his field agents wrote correspondences with historical information based on people's questions and their inquiries. Some wrote him seeking counsel about how to strategically navigate certain educational spaces due to racism within the educational setting. So he was also providing a lot of consultation consultations and professional development in the institution. He also mailed textbooks and mailed Negro history kits to educators across the country. And so these Negro history kits, were designed for children, and he would send them out to these different schools or these different places, and they were I believe, $2 a piece at the time. And these educational kits, these Black history kits or Negro history kits, would have speeches from influential Black speakers. It would have quotes, memorable quotes, and imagery and pictures, and a list of resources for people to conduct further research. So these Black history kits were a part of the community outreach for the association, and it was in this institution, it was in this home here, that this stuff was being put together, and there were meetings and gatherings that were happening to think about ways to best reach out and to connect with the community. There were Negro History Week circulars that were put out. They designed and created decorative materials to help Black educators decorate their office spaces, and their classrooms. There was material provided for clubs. Teachers oftentimes corresponded and wrote back and spoke about how the Negro History Week celebrations went, how the students were, how this information that the students were receiving, how it was impacting them psychologically. And so this was not in the era of email. This was not in the era of, phone calling in the way that it is now. This is not in the area of Dropbox, or AirDrop. This was old fashioned, pick up your pen and pencil and write it and send it out. And so once again, it just spoke to the tenacity and how hard he and the organization were dedicated to pushing forth the narrative of Black excellence and having history substantiate and support that. One of the things that the association did, as Dr. Carter G Woodson was at the forefront, one of the things that they did that was very critical and very important during this time was working with colored teachers associations. Colored teachers associations were were associations where educators of color would come together. They would convene, usually in different school jurisdictions, especially in the South, but sprinkled throughout the country. There would be opportunities for educators to come together and review content and discuss content. I think, Sharice, did your hand go up?
No,
Okay.
unintentional, sorry.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Just wanted to make sure that I didn't overlook you there. So colored teachers associations were really, really big. Colored teachers associations served as a way to protect colored educators, and it gave them a sense of safety and a sense of refuge whenever they were having to deal with all of the things that they were up against. The colored PTA, the churches, the community centers, these intellectual networks, this was the bread and butter, so to speak, of who Dr. Carter G. Woodson and his association worked with primarily. We're still talking about segregated color schools, many of which, and so these educators were scholars of the craft. They were scholars oftentimes of the profession of teaching. And so, Carter G. Woodson would provide scholarship and theory on educators, on influential Black educators, and, pedagogy and ways to be able to teach different perspectives. He was involved in every avenue and every facet of Black educators cultivating themselves and also teaching Black children with a high standard of excellence. And so he also traveled physically. He traveled throughout DC. He was known as a pretty physically fit man. He would walk everywhere he would go. In fact, the Phyllis Wheatley YMCA was located a couple blocks down from the center, or from the home that where he lived and where the association would convene. So he wasn't much of a cook, I don't believe. So he would go down to the Phyllis Wheatley YMCA, and they knew him, he knew them. They had a good relationship, and they knew when he would come and he would eat the food there. He would partake of the meals there. However, beyond DC, he traveled. And so he would be a lecturer. Once again, he spoke to the richness of the history of the African American experience. He wrote textbooks and brought it on the road with him. He did national PDs, professional developments. He mailed stuff, as I mentioned, and shipped stuff out. He helped institute a home study program as well, for those who wanted to bring Black history within the confines of their home. And he also provided internship opportunities. So a number of individuals who worked with him within the organization, within the association, he actually helped to fund a portion, if not all, of their schooling. So Dr. Carter G. Woodson didn't only just obtain his PhD, but it was also his mission and focus to help others obtain their PhD as well too. And there's all types of stories how they would, create these pamphlets, and they would get in the car and they would drive to these different cities, and they would knock on people's doors, and they would say, would you like to donate to our pamphlet here about Black history? And they would tell people, this is only a small portion of what you're going to get in a few months, and you could invest, and you'll have something coming even bigger and greater in time. But it was, they rolled up their sleeves and traveled and really pushed forward to make sure that Black history was viewed in a different light against what society would depict about African Americans. And so even locally, this past summer with the library, I did a 3-part series that was talking about segregation in the Howard County Public Schools. And so even Carter G. Woodson, the work that he did, the work that the association did, even touched down here in Howard County. And so the picture that you see here is a graduation photo of one of the classes of Harriet Tubman Junior Senior High School. And so the high school was the first school in Howard County where Blacks could go. It was a high school, and it was the first one that they could go to that would take them up to the 12th grade. And so from the research that I've come across, and from those that I've talked to who have went to school there, they also knew very much the significance and the importance of Black history. They knew very much so the literature and the material that Carter G. Woodson and the association produced. This was not foreign or not new to them. They knew very much from which it came. So it even impacted the educational experience of those in Howard County at the Harriet Tubman Junior Senior High School. And as I mentioned before, when we talk about the erasure of history, the erasure of Black history, one of the things that was just disheartening to me when I discovered some local Howard County history, when Harriet Tubman was first established, when it was first built, the name Harriet Tubman was denied and kept from being on the front of the building. It wasn't until later on, years, sometime later, that the name Harriet Tubman would be allowed to actually be on the front of the building. But nevertheless, even here in local Howard County, they felt the work that was done, and they were impacted in a positive way. They were influenced in a positive way by what it was that Carter G. Woodson and the association was putting forward. So as you see here, this is Carter G. Woodson working in his office. There's not a whole lot of pictures where you see him smiling, because once again, it was indicative of the hard man, the hard external exterior that he that he represented. However, many say that if there was any group of people that could get to his soft side, that was the children, that was the babies. And so oftentimes, even as interns and those we work with said, Carter G. Woodson doesn't have any hobbies. Carter G. Woodson hardly sleeps. Carter G. Woodson works 18-hour days. You know, Carter G. Woodson is a strict man, a stern man. You know, when Carter G. Woodson spoke, no dog would bark. They would say all these things about Carter G. Woodson. However, when it came to the children, they were usually able to get to his softer side. And that at the core was behind the work that Carter G. Woodson did and what the association did. You see here in the center, an image here with Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And so February, coldest month of the year and 28 days and the shortest one. These are things I'm sure a number of us have heard. But when Carter G. Woodson set out to establish Negro History Week, he had the birth dates of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln in mind. And so Frederick Douglass was one who was very influential to Carter G. Woodson, his life, his story, his legacy. Abraham Lincoln, some question why Dr. Carter G. Woodson would want to commemorate and recognize Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was known for bringing about the Emancipation Proclamation, even though that did not free the enslaved. The 13th Amendment did. And we still find that even with that, there was still a number of different scenarios and situations where African Americans were still not free in the ways they should have been. But at that time, Carter G. Woodson decided to go with these two individuals that he wanted to recognize. And you see here below, these are just a few different volumes of the Negro History Bulletin. Thurgood Marshall is on the front cover of one. You got the war theme and other things like that. And then you see an image here with Dr. Carter G. Woodson, few of those who are his supporters. And you see on the left-hand side there, Mary McLeod Bethune. And you could look at her face and just tell how much she admired him and what he stood for. And you could also see him, a very upright man, a very, stern fellow. And so moving forward to contemporary times, how did it go from Negro History Week to Black History Month? So when it comes to that, how Dr. Woodson's legacy was furthered, because he passed in 1950, but the work that the association did, on top of all of the things that were happening in the 60s, a Pan-African movement where a number of African Americans, Blacks within the country were starting to embrace their African roots, their heritage, they were beginning to take pride in that. The assassinations of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and the sit-ins and the continuous warfare that was happening racially throughout the country really impacted many students on the college campuses. And so Black United Students, being an organization that was on the campus of Kent State, they decided to take it upon themselves and really push for Black Studies programs and really push to have Negro History Week be expanded to a full month. And so they were one of the first college campuses to do so. And then in 1976, President Gerald Ford actually memorializes Black History Month. And he says these words: "In the bicentennial year of our independence, we can review with admiration the impressive contributions of Black Americans to our national life." And so he's, speaking to the significance of Black history. 76 is now, officialized now as a month. And the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, or Asala, is right there front and center pushing for this to happen as well too. And in 1998, Lauryn Hill, the actress, the singer, the musical talent extraordinaire that she is, credits much of her success, and she even named her iconic classic album, "The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill," after Dr. Carter G. Woodson's legacy and the book that really inspired her, "The Miseducation of the Negro." So her way to commemorate and memorialize Dr. Carter G. Woodson was through his work, and one of his quotes that he's known for: "When you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions." So we see it, she's just one of many who have paid homage to the legacy of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And so when we talk about all of this information and all of this stuff that we're saying when it comes to Black history and Carter G. Woodson and all of this, how can this stuff impact us in the present? How can all of this stuff impact us today? What difference does it make? And so I believe that it can impact how we think, how we see each other, and how we move in a positive way. And so empathy, as we look towards the trials and tribulations of what those that have gone through before us, as we look at the sacrifices that were made, not just Carter G. Woodson, but as we look about all the historical Black figures and the figures in general that have paved the way for us to be here, it should help us put ourselves in their shoes and do something that is called historical empathizing, where we can be able to look at an individual or a group of people and say, if I was in their situation, how would I think? How would I behave? How would I act? So history can really help us cultivate empathy. History can also inspire us, because when we're inspired, then we're provoked to do something. We're inspired to carry out the legacy of somebody who's done something. We're inspired to create something out of nothing. We're inspired to make things happen. And so Carter G. Woodson made things happen. And so history can also propel us and inspire us through the stories, through the perspectives, and through the ups and downs. Well, if they could do it, and if they could push through and persevere, so can I. History can give us gratitude. It can give us a renewed sense of appreciation for those who have come before us, as I've said, and it can make us even be humble for the quality of life that we have now, that those before us did not have a chance to experience. It can help us to heal. Now, with the talk about not teaching certain aspects of history and critical race theory and different things like that, you can ignore history and act like things didn't happen, but the trauma, the historical trauma, the visceral body reaction, all of these things still remain. But if we can grapple with history, if we could come to grips with it, if we could confront what they refer to as hard history, it can help us that further along heal. So history can be a vehicle and a tool to heal, and history can be a vehicle to spark critical thinking. So what I suggest oftentimes, as I've said to my students and those that I talk with, it's important now to come from a strength-based approach and move away from the deficit-based approach. Yes, there were things that African Americans have been through, such as slavery and such as violence and different atrocities, but there's also perseverance. There's also resistance. There's also resilience. And so now is a time to go broader, to go beyond the simple narratives of simplicity and really break down with more of a critical eye and with more critical examination this history that has for so long been oversimplified and that is made so black and white and so simple, so to speak. There's also research that suggests, and this is research that was done by Dr. Colette Chapman Hilliard of the College of Staten Island. She's in the psychology department, and she worked alongside with Dr. Valerie Adams Bass, who's a part of University of Virginia. And what they speak to is that in their research, Black history knowledge can impact mental health in a positive way of children and those engaging with Black history. So how is that? Well, what they say is that exposure to narratives about the complexity of history can be able to help children per se perform better in school and have a greater sense of social adjustment. And what they're saying is that learning history could be deemed as a coping tool. So as students are dealing with uh, situations of discrimination, and as they might encounter different aspects of racism in their life, if they could look back and say, oh, well, if Dr. Martin Luther King went through this, and if he persevered and overcame that, if Harriet Tubman persevered and overcame in this way, so Sojourner Truth went through this, but she still was still standing, that I can make it through my situation. So their research pretty much just speaks to the power of story and the power of narratives, and how that can be combated with counter narratives to be able to change the consciousness and the outlook of those Black children. And we spoke about last week about stereotype threat and how narratives can impact us in negative ways, creating anxiety, fear, doubt, worry, and will I have to work so much harder to overcompensate for the negative stereotype. However, with counter narratives, it can be something that could boost self-esteem. It can boost self-value, self-worth. And then in the next part of the research that was done, it also speaks about learning Black history knowledge and how it could impact an individual, especially a student, to want to make a difference in their community, volunteerism work, and taking on a stance to speak out against injustices. And you find that all the way back in the past, as we said before, when it came to the uprisings, when it came to the revolts, when it came to a lot of those things, at the helm and at the forefront were those who were ministers, or those who were educators, or those who were literate in some way, shape, or form. So by actually grappling with this history and not avoiding it, but confronting it and addressing it dead on, it's not just only for Black people, but by embracing the stories of the Black experience from a humanistic standpoint, everybody wins. So there's a tremendous amount of research that comes with not just memorizing Black history facts and regurgitating, but whenever it's internalized, whenever there can be conversations and discussions and dialogues about this, and whenever we change the themes and how we approach teaching, there could be a lot of positive things that are done. As I get to a close, here are some resources here. Feel free to take a snapshot. We'll also make sure that we follow up and give everybody the resources as well. But there's some online resources here. There's some books. There's some museums, to take advantage of. There's some children's books here as well. And then these here are some specific resources on Dr. Carter G. Woodson himself. And these range from, chapter books with footnotes and citations to simple children's books. So these are just some of the books here. And there's a few other books that I have as well here with me. The Education of Blacks in the South, 1860 to 1935. Their Highest Potential, African American School Community in the Segregated South by Vanessa Siddle Walker. Pero Dagbovi, Reclaiming the Past, the Use and Misuse of African American History in the 21st Century. And there's a whole host of other resources that we'll be sure to get out to you. But nevertheless, I just want to conclude with this quote here by Amanda Gorman. She says, "Being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it." And so an example of what we talked about all last week and up to today. Amanda Gorman was really glad and was really excited and proud of her moment to be able to recite her poem at the inauguration. But before then, and there's an article I came across that spoke to this, she was afraid. She was fearful. She was nervous and uncomfortable with even getting up to showcase her ability and to showcase her talent and to put her Black display of excellence out there, because she didn't know if she would become a target. She didn't know if she would become attacked. She didn't know if her safety or if her family's safety or if the safety of her family, friends, and loved ones would be impacted. But she still stepped out on faith. She still persevered and went through it and did it and inspired a multitude of people the world over. And so as we reflect on history, let us reflect on our personal lives and how we show up in this history. And let us be cognizant of our own blind spots that we may have, so we can be real with ourselves to know what we're pushing forward. And so I'm so delighted and I'm so humbled to be able to be inspired by the works of those who have gone before me. I'm definitely inspired by the works of Dr. Carter G. Woodson, and I am so appreciative that everybody tuned in for this two-part series last Tuesday and today. And so at this time, I am going to turn it over back to you, Sharice, and Nancy, and I'll be more than happy to engage with questions or comments or anything like that. And let me also just put this up as well in case somebody was trying to get a hold of me or wanted to follow up with a question or anything like that. But once again, I'm delighted and I'm humbled and I'm honored to be able to speak to the legacy of Carter G. Woodson and the significance and the value of Black history. Thank you very much.
So much. Thank you, Marcus. We really appreciate this excellent talk. We have several questions. Just to reiterate to everyone, we will be sharing the resources in an email. Marcus, I would leave that last slide up so that people can get the information.
Okay.
In fact, if you want to back up to the slide with the books on it, I know some people wanted to take screenshots of it.
Sure thing.
So give everybody another opportunity. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So we had a question earlier. How was Dr. Woodson funded?
All right. Well, thank you for that question. That's a good question. So Dr. Woodson was funded in a few different ways. Dr. Woodson was able to write prolifically, and his writing ability, his ability to use his academic training and his objective writing was able to get him to get grants. He was actually, for instance, he got a grant from in 1921 from what was it? The Carnegie Institute, which helped to fund him starting his publishing company, the Associated Publishers. But what ended up happening was, as the movement was developing more and more, as it was taking off and it was starting to expand, he relied less on the white philanthropy, because he did not want to be controlled and he didn't want to be governed and micromanaged. But the good part about that was that he relied on the support from the Black churches and different segments of the Black community, Black schools, Black parents. The challenge with Carter G. Woodson, though, was that he was so giving and he was so selfless. He a lot of times refused to charge people for anything. He would a lot of times send stuff out for free and not charge people. And his heart was in the right place. But there are those who critique his work and say, one of the things that came to sort of catch up with Carter G. Woodson and the movement was just being so generous, kind of just giving the information away when it was something, that needed to be supported. But once again, the Black community stood strong for Carter G. Woodson as much as they could, and really helped to also fund a lot of what it was that Carter G. Woodson and the movement was able to do.
Thank you. Do you by any chance know who was the first African-American woman to get a PhD in Black history? We had that question earlier in the chat.
You know what? I can't think of her name right now. I'm sure it's going to come to me. It'll come back. It'll come back.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll come back. It's a great question. And she was actually in the presentation last week. Julia Cooper, I believe.
Okay, Julia Cooper. Okay.
But yeah, and to that point, by 1940, there were 40 African Americans who actually ended up having a PhD degree. So as I mentioned before, Carter G. Woodson was inspired by those who came before him, but then he was also inspiration to those who he came before, those who came after him. So yes.
And do we know about Dr. Woodson's personal life, his family, any children?
So when it comes, that's a great question. So when it comes to Dr. G. Woodson's personal life, and as I mentioned before, he wasn't known to have much of a personal life. He didn't marry. He had no children. He always would say, "My children are all of these children that I'm sending materials to, the ones that I'm teaching, the ones that I am sharing this information with." He was not known to even have a hobby. He devoted himself to the life and struggle of the African American experience. And so for sure, his work-life balance could be critiqued and questioned for sure. But I also think that, once again, his work ethic that he cultivated as a young person helped be the driving force of why he worked so hard and strove towards what he did. And so that was pretty much him. And he said, if I had a wife, I would be married. I wouldn't be able to give her the best that I could give her. And it's funny that this is, after Valentine's Day, but he was honest about it. He said, if I had a wife, I wouldn't be able to, give her the best I could, because I'm devoted to the movement and I'm devoted to the cause. So that's a little bit about his personal life. Everything to him was about pushing forward and expanding how we see Black history.
We have a question about the mental health benefits of learning about African American heritage. You've spoken so much about not having erasure and how it's so important to share the history and the heritage. Do you think that extends to other minority populations, learning about the history of the African American progress in the United States? Is there a mental health benefit to that for other groups as well?
Well, yeah, and that's a point that I tried to make, was that by learning, Black history is not just for Black people, or it's not just for African Americans. Carter G. Woodson, he allowed some white writers to even be able to write some columns for the Negro History Bulletin. Now, it was still governed by him and the association. It was still a predominantly Black governed affair. But what Carter G. Woodson stood on was saying, this is not just Black people's history. Yes, this is us telling our side of the story and giving evidence historically. But when we look at history, and we look at what happened on the slave plantation, we look at what's happened through Reconstruction, we look at what's happened through civil rights, we look at what happened in the slave, we look at what history has shown beyond race, because race is a social construct. From a humanistic aspect, we can be able to empathize with a person who has been split up from their husband, or a person who's been split up from their home, or a person who has been denied the opportunity that they're deserved. So even though we're talking about Black history, you don't have to only be Black to be able to learn from the lessons of what African Americans have went through. And so the history comes with the triumphs, the ups and the downs, grief, loss, resilience, courage, even beyond color. These are all universal principles that we all can connect with. And so if we look at Black history from more of a humanizing aspect, as Carter G. Woodson was trying to, then we could all be able to find something in that could impact us psychologically and mentally. So I always like to use Black history as a tool to connect. How can we connect with each other? And if we approach it from that way, then I think we'll be a lot better off.
Agreed. Do you want to forward your slides to your contact information so there's another opportunity for people to see that, please? Thank you. We have another question about negative stereotypes. In the chat, people, one of the attendees referred to the negative stereotypes that can be perpetuated. I think they mean in popular culture, like how people talk to each other, maybe in rap lyrics or in, sitcoms on TV, things that perpetuate some negative language. And how can we encourage young people to follow more positive mentors and more positive language in speaking to each other?
That's a great question. I would say that I think as adults, as parents, as educators, teachers, I think it starts with us. I know the question was about children, but who's going to model that? Who's going to model how we interact with each other, how we respect each other, the bias that we might have, now the term that's often used is the implicit bias. We all have blind spots. So our children are looking to us, as we talked about in the presentation today, a lot of this racism and the anti-Black stereotypes, this stuff was taught. This stuff was passed down. And so Carter G. Woodson's his aim was to interrupt this. And so when it comes to young people, I would say first it starts with what we're modeling as adults. I would also say that how we look at history. Once again, I've seen so many students be able to like be so moved and touched by seeing what African Americans have went through, and so it's important to balance these narratives. Like a lot of students, they see themselves through the lens of history, so they don't only disrespect other students. They might not like themselves. They might disrespect themselves. They might not have a positive, healthy view of themselves. Mental health is huge. And so a lot of times the social media and the imagery that we see on TV and on the news, these things perpetuates a lot of stereotypes. I mean, so what we consume in the media, the news, the TV, a lot of times, unfortunately, we see these negative stereotypes depicted right in front of our eyes by seeing many Blacks, African Americans up whenever there's some criminal activity or when something is done that's negative. And so this gets imprinted in the mind. I tell my students, take a fast, take a social media fast, take a media fast. And you know, because it's so impressionable. It's so impressionable. So those are some of the things that I would say as well. And then, you know, also talk to the student and see why they be acting, why they behave the way in which they do. And a lot of times students are acting out because they're not listened to. They're acting out based on their own personal experiences or what's going on. So a lot of times students are not just acting out just because they want to act out in certain ways, or they're treating people in certain ways. A lot of times the person that they're disrespecting or targeting or whatever, a lot of times it's indirect. The anger, the stereotyping, it's really misplaced. It's really something at the core root that's really going on. So this is a lot to really unravel and a lot to uncover. And I could go on and on and on, but I won't, because I know there may be some other questions and other things. But I would say those things for this particular time. But I think it's a good question.
Thanks so much. Yeah, there's definitely a lot to discuss there for sure. We have time for one more question. So segueing into what we're talking about regarding students, one of the attendees says, I teach history to students from 6th grade through college across Louisiana. Hello, Louisiana. So this attendee teaches in Louisiana. How do we best get this wonderful material you shared into the state's curriculum? Are there any efforts to do this?
Well, that's a great question. And, you know, to be honest, I'm working to get a lot of this stuff into spaces where, you know, this stuff could be learned. I think it has to do a lot of times with the local school boards, and what history has shown once again is it's not necessarily an individual effort, but it really a lot of times is a culmination of the community. Back in the day, you know, you had the PTA and the parents and the color teachers associations and organizations like Asala, who were banding together and creating an organized front to push for different things. No, they didn't always get what they wanted, but a number of times they did. And so when it comes to being able to get this information material in curriculums and in schools and stuff like that, there are certain entities that are already doing this. We could also talk about it all on offline, but also I would say, you know, organize yourself, get a game plan down, bring it to the school board, you know, have something crisp and strong to push forward with. We know that the sign of the times now, there's a lot of entities that don't want this stuff to be taught. You know, and everybody doesn't value Black history like everybody else does, but it's not to deter us from still pushing forward with that. But Carter G Woodson said this as well too. Carter G Woodson said, you know, there's two types of educations. One education which you're given, but then there's also the education that you give yourself. So, you know, the schools are important. Students spend a huge amount of time in school. They spend a lot of time with their teachers. However, the family unit, what the students learn in the family, is very important. The libraries and the other community learning centers, now online, there's a ton of resources. So not just putting it all on the schools. The schools have a lot that they need to do and should do, yes. However, it's not just solely about the schools. And, you know, I like what Carter G. Woodson is saying, because he's saying you could wait for somebody to give you something. You could, you know, take advantage of the opportunity and seize the time and get it yourself, you know, and that's what he and many others had to do. So I would say that based for that question. Good question though.
Thank you again, Marcus. We are running out of time, so we are going to have to close out this program. Thank you everyone for joining. I'm just going to open this up to Nancy in case she has any closing remarks. But before that, Marcus, is there anything else that you wanted to tell us before we end the program?
No, just thank you everybody for tuning in. I appreciated everybody who did tune in. And I want to thank you, Sharice and Nancy, as well too, for having me for the second go round. It was fun, and I look forward to also sharing resources as well as a follow up from this as well.
Excellent. And I just want to go on the record, Marcus, and now encourage you once again that we are still waiting for your book. So we hope you are working on that, and we'll be making an author stop at the Howard County Library System to talk about your upcoming book, because you have a lot of fans here tonight. So thank you for empowering, educating, and inspiring us by giving us a greater awareness of African American culture and history this evening. We are grateful for everything that you've shared with us tonight. We wish everybody a lovely evening. We'll stick around for another minute or two. I'm going to have my wonderful coworker, Sharice, turn off the recording. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Marcus.
Welcome.